Hi everyone, welcome back. Let's dive into today's story. It was a night Mark would never forget. His son, face tear-streaked, rushed into his arms, desperate for comfort. The moment was heavy with emotion, and Mark felt the full weight of everything that had happened. His son's pain mirrored his own. In that quiet moment of holding his child, Mark realized that he couldn't afford to lose sight of what mattered most: his children's emotional well-being. Together, they sat in the living room, trying to create a semblance of normalcy amidst the emotional chaos. Later that night, Mark gathered his children to talk openly about therapy. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but it was a necessary step toward healing. His hope was that therapy would help them process the emotional storm that had resulted from the betrayal they'd all faced. Thomas, who had been seeing a therapist for his own healing, offered his full support, encouraging the children to give it a try. Thomas's gentle encouragement gave Mark's children the assurance they needed to embrace the idea, marking a turning point in their journey toward recovery. Meanwhile, Mark reflected on the barrage of texts and calls from his estranged wife. Blocking her felt like a small act of liberation, even though the emotions tied to that decision were complicated. The estranged relationship with her and the distance it created was painful, but Mark was resolute. His children's well-being was non-negotiable. The pain of severing ties with his parents, who had failed to support him, was an added burden, but the priority was clear. His children needed him to lead them through this emotional turmoil. Every decision Mark made was for them, even if it meant facing personal sacrifices. As days passed, Mark saw how differently his children were coping with the aftermath of the betrayal. His daughter's heartache was a confusing mix of anger and lingering love. One moment, she would express her fury toward her mother, and the next, she would quietly wish for her comfort. It left Mark feeling like an outsider, helpless in his inability to soothe her pain. He could see how torn she was, her internal battle between love and hurt playing out in ways she couldn't articulate. A particular moment stood out to Mark. His daughter, in the midst of an emotional outburst, accidentally called Thomas Dad. The word stung at first, but Mark didn't see it as an issue. He gently reassured her, reminding her that she could never replace the relationship she had with her biological father. But it was clear, his daughter wasn't seeking a new father. She just needed stability and love, and Thomas's presence offered that. Mark's firm stance on boundaries didn't waver, yet his heart softened for his daughter, who was simply trying to navigate a broken world. In contrast, Mark's son withdrew even further. He became emotionally closed off, a fact that pained Mark to his core. Late one night, Mark found his son quietly crying in his room. The scene was heart-wrenching, and Mark could only offer his presence. Sitting with him, he let his son cry, offering a hug and staying close until he fell asleep. Those quiet moments, although devoid of words, became Mark's way of sharing in his son's pain. His silent, steadfast love offered the one thing his son needed most: a safe place to grieve. Amid the chaos, Mark began to lean on those who showed him kindness and understanding. Thomas, who had endured his own emotional challenges, became an unwavering pillar of support. Thomas's calm presence provided a counterbalance to Mark's inner turmoil. His partner, Logan, was a pleasant surprise. Although new to the family, Logan's warm-hearted nature made a significant impact on Mark's children. They slowly began to find comfort in Logan's presence, and, for the first time in weeks, there was a sense of relief, a glimmer of hope. Mark's son, who had been reticent and closed off, began to bond with Logan and Thomas. Slowly, he started to find joy in their company, something Mark had feared might be lost forever. Mark watched with cautious optimism as his son laughed again, even if only for a moment. His daughter, though more hesitant, started to engage with him in small ways. Each day brought a little more openness, a little more trust. But it wasn't just the children who were starting to heal. Mark himself found his heart softening in unexpected ways. He met someone who sparked a flame in him, someone who reminded him of what love could feel like after so much hurt. The connection was tentative, slow, and Mark was careful not to rush it. The focus remained on his children and their healing, but the budding romance was a reminder that joy and love still had a place in his life. He couldn't afford to ignore the possibility of new beginnings, even if he wasn't ready to fully embrace them yet. Mark's resolve to maintain firm boundaries was tested in more ways than one. The gifts his ex-wife sent him, intended to win him back, were a constant reminder of the emotional manipulation he had endured. The decision to donate those gifts felt like an act of reclaiming his power, transforming the remnants of his past into something meaningful. Donating the items to women's shelters and orphanages allowed Mark to channel his pain into something productive. It was his way of saying, "This chapter is over." The situation with his sister also required delicate handling. While he couldn't deny the struggle she was facing, Mark knew that his own emotional safety and that of his children had to come first. He made it clear that any assistance he would offer her would be strictly financial. There was no room for her back into their lives, not while the wounds of betrayal were still so fresh. His boundaries were necessary for his own healing, and while they were difficult, Mark understood their importance. He realized that maintaining these boundaries wasn't about malice. It was about protecting the fragile world he was rebuilding with his children. No one could cross those lines without consequences. His ex-wife, his parents, and his sister had all failed him in different ways, but Mark was learning to rebuild his life around the things that mattered most: his children's happiness and his own peace of mind. The betrayal Mark faced in his past relationship resurfaced in his mind, dragging him back into old wounds. He had met his ex-girlfriend at work, and the initial connection had been intoxicating. But when he discovered her infidelity, it shattered everything. What hurt most wasn't just the act of betrayal. It was the manipulation that followed. She twisted the truth, accusing him of cheating and fabricating evidence to destroy his reputation. The emotional devastation of losing not only his partner, but also the trust of his family was more than Mark could bear. What made the experience even worse was his mother's belief in the lies. She sided with his ex-girlfriend, turning her back on him at his lowest point. The hurt was profound, not just from the betrayal of a lover, but from the loss of a parent's support. Mark felt truly abandoned, left to navigate his pain alone. The emotional toll was unbearable, and it took years for him to even begin to recover. Through the darkness, Mark's best friend was the one constant. His friend offered a listening ear, a shoulder to cry on, and the kind of support that no one else could give. Mark could still remember the nights he would break down in his friend's arms, feeling lost and broken, but also feeling a small glimmer of hope that, despite everything, love and friendship were still alive. A year after the fallout with his mother, Mark received an unexpected apology. She came to him, tearfully asking for forgiveness. She admitted that she had believed the lies his ex-girlfriend had told her, and for that, she was deeply regretful. Her apology shook Mark to his core. The pain she had caused him was still fresh, and he couldn't erase the years of emotional abandonment with a few words. But Mark listened, torn between anger and the desire for closure. He realized that while her apology was sincere, trust couldn't be rebuilt overnight. Her actions had consequences, and the scars were still there. Yet, as he listened, he began to see her not just as a mother, but as a woman who had her own struggles with betrayal, struggles that had clouded her judgment. This insight helped Mark understand her more, but it didn't lessen the pain. In the end, Mark set firm boundaries. He told his mother that trust would take time to rebuild, and that he wasn't ready to let her back into his life fully. The conversation was raw and emotional, and while it didn't provide immediate closure, it was a step forward. Therapy had been a slow process for Mark. It wasn't easy to confront the layers of hurt and betrayal that had built up over the years. But with each session, Mark began to unravel the knots of his pain. He started to see that healing wasn't a straight path. It was a winding, unpredictable journey. But each step forward, no matter how small, was progress. As he worked through his own emotions, Mark noticed his mother's actions shifting. She began to show up more consistently, offering support in small ways. She helped with moving his things, called to check in, and slowly, Mark began to see the sincerity in her efforts. Yet, he remained cautious. The trust between them had been broken, and it would take more than gestures to repair it. Mark had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant finding a way to move forward with the lessons learned. In the midst of all this, Mark felt a shift in his emotional landscape. His resentment toward his grandparents and ex-girlfriend faded. The past no longer held as much weight. His focus had narrowed. It wasn't about pleasing others. It was about creating a safe, healing space for his children and for himself. Forgiveness was a decision that took Mark by surprise. The weight of anger had grown too heavy for him to carry any longer. He realized that holding on to resentment only kept him tethered to the past, preventing him from moving forward. Forgiveness didn't mean condoning the wrongs that had been done. It simply meant that Mark was no longer going to allow them to control his future. When Mark finally forgave his mother, the relief that washed over him was profound. Her reaction was one of shock, followed by deep gratitude. She had spent so many years in her own emotional pain, but this moment was a turning point. Her tears were not just for the apology. They were for the years lost, the connection that had been severed. And Mark, too, felt a sense of lightness. Forgiving her wasn't about erasing the past. It was about making peace with it. With that, Mark stepped into a new chapter of his life. He knew that the journey of healing was ongoing, but the pain of betrayal no longer had the same hold on him. His children were healing, and so was he. Together, they had weathered the storm, and while the road ahead was still uncertain, Mark knew that love, in all its forms, was worth the fight. If this story of resilience and redemption touched your heart, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to Lost Love Mystery. Your support allows us to continue bringing you heartfelt tales like this one. Have a story of your own? We'd love to hear it. Share your journey with us. Stay tuned for more stories that remind us of the strength and beauty within every heart.